What is your emotional reaction to the Uvalde school shooting? 19 children were killed and 2 teachers, and now the police response is being questioned. People are in an uproar about gun control and mental health, and there's just so much emotion around what has just happened. This came up for me a couple days ago when one of my counselors said, what do we do to help people process these injustices? In the Mentally Strong Method, we talk about thinking, organizing, and choosing. And in the organization, we actually have 10 categories, and one of them is injustice. In this school shooting, and every school shooting, is a major injustice. Injustice is something that's not fair, it's not right, yet we feel like we have no control over it. So what do we do with injustices? There's so many injustices in this world. We learn from a very young age that life isn't fair. But when we are bombarded with an extreme case of an injustice for these kids, for these families, for this community, our heart breaks, and many of us are having an emotional reaction. But we have to remember that our emotional reactions are coming from within. And that's why in the Mentally Strong Method, we actually put these things into different categories. And so this was my challenge to the counselor that asked me, what do you do with these injustices? How do you help people process them? And the importance here is that we don't allow it to leak in to the other areas. And this often happens. This is why I'm adamant about teaching people how to organize their brain, because when something like this happens, we have an emotional reaction, some of which is about this injustice, right? Some of it is truly like, this is an injustice, this should not happen, we have to do something about this, right? And in those injustices, the power of choice may be to take action. But also there could be an emotional reaction to the action, right? Many people are trying to take action, and so they're talking about gun control, they're talking about mental health, but then there might be an emotional reaction to how somebody is talking about that. Maybe you really feel like you should have free access to any kind of gun that you want, and it brings on fear when people start talking about gun control because of people that do this, right? And so even in the action of the injustice, there could be emotional reactions. So again, taking a step back, taking a deep breath, evaluating what is your emotional reaction, right? That's what insight is about. You can be more effective if you have insight into what your emotional reaction is. So for example, this school shooting or any school shooting could be a trigger for you in something that's happening for you. It could be the trigger of, government control over you. It could be a trigger of, I have mental health problems personally or in my family, and I don't want myself or my family to be judged like we're dangerous just because we are struggling with a mental health concern, right? It could be a trigger for this loss of control. It could be a trigger for some personal things that you experienced as a child. It could be a trigger for your own personal trauma. Maybe you witnessed something that involved a gun when you were a child, and thank God you survived, but you are envisioning yourself as one of those children in that room, right? So just the information could be an emotional trigger for you. And so that's one of our categories. Like, let's just define the trigger. What is it that's causing that emotional reaction for you? We also need to separate grief. Being a mother who has lost children, not in that way, but I am grieving the loss of my children, and I feel the pain of those mothers and fathers who have lost their children. And so that is my grief. But also on top of that, there's a collective grief. We are a community of people, and 19 children just died in a matter of a couple hours. And even if you don't even live in Texas, there's still this collective grief of human beings have gotten to this point. Somebody killed children. And that is, being presented to us in the news. And so not only do we have that collective grief, but we also could be continuing to trigger that collective grief by continuing to watch the news, right? But do you see how these need to be in separate categories? Because you have to have insight into what your emotional reaction is. And it could also be bringing up lots of fears. If you are a mother, and you maybe are already afraid to send your children to school, or you don't let them out of your sight, or there's this fear of something happening to your child, and then the reality of your absolute worst nightmare, we have to identify that. And that's why that fear, that anxiety goes in its own category, so that when we make a choice, it's specifically for that fear, and that we're not just reacting to the whole emotional reaction, right? Protect your children. Whatever you need to do as you are working through this, you do that. But also thinking about that balance and the freedom and, allowing our children to leave our side and to not be afraid of everything, right? So there is, the mild to moderate anxiety and fear that is okay. Like, unfortunately, our children are not safe, right? And we should be doing everything that we can to prevent this from happening to your child or to any child. But if we allow that to creep up into moderate and severe, sometimes panic anxiety, it's debilitating. Then this event that happened is beginning to control you and your choices, right? So anxiety's got to be its own category. We've got to learn it's a continuum. I'm not saying don't be afraid. It's been clear that there are things to be afraid of. But let's move that anxiety to mild, moderate, being aware, learning safety, and but not allowing it to be paralyzing. This also brings up huge spiritual conflict. If there is a God that loves and protects us, loves the little children of the world, how could he allow such a thing to happen? That is a different category, and it needs to be processed and brought to light in insight and choices in its own category. And then, even really recognizing how this is maybe pushing your core buttons, the things that really keep you down. One of the things for me is that I just feel like life is so hard. Like I keep fighting, like life is a fight, and just bad things keep happening. That's one of my core beliefs that I'm trying to change. But when these kinds of things happen, it's like evidence that, life is hard and it's not getting any better. So how do we manage our emotional reaction to this? And what do we do with the injustices that we are presented in this world? One, keeping the injustice itself in its own category, because unfortunately, we can't change what happened. Allowing yourself to grieve and how it might be bringing your own grief up to the surface. Any negative thoughts that you're thinking, that's what you have control of. You have control of your emotional reaction. And for some people, an injustice means taking action. But sometimes you don't get the opportunity. I'll give you an example. I've lost 3 children, not to violence, but I understand that kind of grief. And so we've reached out to a couple of churches and local organizations that are responding to this shooting and saying, these are my expertise. I'm an expert in grief, and I would love to, come and offer my services, right? That's an action that I am attempting to take, but no one has invited me. So there's not an actual action I can do today about that particular thing. For some people, the action is getting behind some sort of legislations on gun control and mental health, and that's okay. If that is your calling, your purpose, and that's why this power of choice is personal. But also remember how that could be triggering other people, right? Because we are a community. And I think that in times like this, if we could come together in that collective grief and try to find things that prevent it in the future in a caring, loving way, and communicating that in a caring, loving way. And just remember, everybody's emotional reaction is about their personal story. And so our first step in dealing with injustices is self-reflection, insight. Go through the Mentally Strong method, map it out. What else is going on? What are your triggers? Does it bring up other grief? Do you have trauma that you haven't processed? How are you talking to yourself? What are your fears, and how do you manage those fears? And be real with your spiritual conflict. And just making yourself a better person as we try to take action on these injustices. So, horrible example of an injustice. And it obviously brings up a lot of grief for me. But I've done what I can do. I've reached out. I've said I'm willing to help. And now I have to wait to see if I'm invited to help. And that's why using the whole Mentally Strong method personally is going to help in really revolutionizing the culture of mental health. It's not just about the one guy who clearly is demonstrating some sort of major mental health concern. But we all are on a mental health journey, and our reaction is the only thing that we can control. And how do we control that? We control it by having insight into it, organizing it, and making choices in line with what we want. I believe that we all have it in us, and I believe that you are mentally strong. If you got to the end of the video, you obviously enjoyed some of the content. I have a lot of free content out there. I am really trying to empower everyone to find their mental strength. So subscribe, get the actual notifications. Let's embrace this journey of mental strength. See you there.